Hey guys, Michael Manticon here, and this is The Other Side of the Desk, a podcast that talks about special education, disability empowerment, and inclusion from the viewpoint of someone who has been on both sides of the desk in special education, both as a special education student and now soon to be a special education teacher. Today we're talking about what autism actually is. Because though we have scientific definitions, and though many people have more colloquial definitions of what autism is, there are very few definitions out there that bear into mind the experiences of people that are actually on the spectrum. So let's begin. So autism is talked about a lot, but it's often misunderstood. Many people only know about autism through maybe media stereotypes or shows they've seen, or maybe they only know about it from extreme portrayals, like either you're a genius if you're on the spectrum, or you're like completely incapable of living an independent life. In this episode, I wanted to set the foundation for future conversations we'll have on the podcast about autism and how reality often differs from the stereotypes. So imagine that you're autistic. I had to deal with that reality since I was 5 years old. When I was 5 years old, a school psychologist took me aside and gave me this label. This label was, at the time, Asperger's disorder. Now it's autism spectrum disorder. But either case, I was labeled. I was the same the day before as I was the day after. Nothing had changed about me, but all of a sudden a lot of people's perceptions changed around me. So imagine you're in that situation and you have autism. Now imagine you've gone through that, gone through 20 years, and now you're becoming a special education teacher. That's the blessing of my life. And that's what I really want to share with everyone out there. Imagine you've lived autism and studied it from the professional side. You just haven't lived it. You've also studied the literature. You've studied the applied behavior analysis, and you've studied special education law, and you've studied educational psychology. That's where I am right now. I don't want to make this into an episode where I'm giving a clinical definition, though. There's a lot of clinical definitions out there for autism. We don't need clinical definitions in the world right now. We need human definitions. So, what is autism? So my key idea here is autism is a neurodevelopmental difference. And I use the word difference rather than disability because disability conjures up the idea of something less. It's just inherent to the word, whether or not that's truly what the word means in the purest clinical sense. That's what it means in the conversational sense. And it can be a disability sometimes, but autism can also be an amazing ability. It can make people very high and very almost genius level, like there are conceptions of in certain domains. But this idea that autism is either makes you a genius or it makes you severely disabled is not true, not necessarily true, because there's just so much more to the spectrum, and we are just like anyone else. We just have a neurodevelopmental difference, like I said before. This neurodevelopmental difference affects how a person communicates. It affects how we process sensory information, affects how we understand social cues, that's a big one, and it regulates emotion and attention. What's important to know about that is those can all be challenges or they can all be strengths, but they're not what you would call systemic to something that's a disease or something you catch or something that needs to be cured. Autism is none of those things. Autism is a different operating system, not a broken one, to borrow a metaphor from the technological realm. So, the autism spectrum. What does spectrum actually mean? The common misconception is that there's this spectrum, and it's a unilateral spectrum in that on one side there's the extremely genius, mildly autistic person who just has a few personality quirks but otherwise is a genius. And on the other side of the spectrum is someone who can't function in day-to-day life, and they're intensely disabled. There can be characteristics of that in people, but I would invite you to look away from the spectrum as being moderate to severe. Moderate or mild to severe. There's mild, moderate, severe. Those are common words in the scientific literature, but I would like you to think of that purely in a scientific literature sense, in more of a descriptor for psychology and not for our humanity. So a spectrum means there's many traits. There's not one unilateral trait. There's many traits, many combinations. People may differ in communication style, or they may differ in sensory needs, executive functioning, or social energy. For example, I'm a very extroverted person. Now, I wasn't always very skilled at social interactions, but in terms of pure social energy, I get high off of people interacting with me and being around people, whereas other people are introverts. Just like someone without autism can be either an extrovert or introvert. So the key point being that support needs can change by environment, by day, or by task. Sometimes there's someone who's really skilled on the spectrum in math or science, but may not be so much in composition or writing. And there may be some people, even people you think would be the most severe autistically, and you look at them and they're like, wow, they can complete a jigsaw puzzle faster than anyone alive. Or they can, and I'm thinking of examples of my own students here, they can draw better than anyone else and they can't even talk. And I'm like, that's not a one-size-fits-all spectrum. In fact, a spectrum, the whole point of a spectrum is not one-size-fits-all or even one scale fits all, but that everyone's different. And everyone has different strengths and different weaknesses. Now, another thing with autism is there's common myths. So let's go over those myths first, and then we'll go over the truth. First, autistic people lack empathy. I can't imagine how many times I've heard this, and it is not true. Many experience deep empathy, but we don't know how to express it, or we express it differently in a valid way, but in a way you're not picking up on. And that's important to note. Now, another myth could be that all autistic people are the same. Autism looks different in every individual. It varies so much. It can vary based on gender, it can vary based on upbringing, all these environments. So there's nature and nurture factors, but there's also down to each individual personality, it changes based on each individual. So another myth is that autism equals intellectual disability. So autism is not an intelligence level. I've worked with many students who have both autism and intellectual disability, and the science and at least the educational standards in the state of California, where I work in special education, these are two completely different diagnoses, and they are not equivalent at all, but some may have both, some may have one or the other. And that's okay. There's amazing things in the world when it comes to both people with autism and people with intellectual disability and people with both. So the last myth is, if you can talk, you're not really autistic. Well, that's not really true. And people can have a wide range of communication abilities and still have that internal experience of autism. I've talked to people recently who say that, man, the way you talk, I had no idea you had autism. And it's flattering in a sense, but it's also a little disappointing in another sense, because it really does symbolize a misconception that just because I can express myself well means I haven't had these experiences and I'm somehow not autistic. And though that's often been expressed to me as a compliment, it's not really a compliment, because I see no problem in being autistic either. So let's talk about autism from the inside and talk a little bit about my lived experience, so we can really delve into the question a little better of what autism is. So one thing I've had in my life is something many people on the spectrum have, and that's sensory overload. Some sounds just sound like nails on a chalkboard to me, and they would not sound that way to you. One thing is when the like a spoon or a fork is scraping on a bowl. My gosh, that hurts. That hurts. And people are looking at me like, what? Another thing is when, like, after I go for a hike and I have to dust my feet off because or dust my shoes off because I might have dirt on my shoes. And that sound and the sound of the other hikers against the sidewalk, it's like, oh my gosh, that everyone looks at me like, why do you feel that way? But that's part of my neurodivergence. So another thing about my lived experience with autism is social exhaustion. And I mentioned that I feel kind of high after work, after interacting with other people. But that's sometimes. Other times, just the fact that I have to mask so much, or felt like in the past that I had to mask so much of my autism. After I get done with the social interaction where I'm not really truly being myself, I come home and I'm like, oh my gosh, that wasn't me, and I had to pretend to be someone else, and that was exhausting. That's another thing that many people with autism live through, regardless if they're introverts or extroverts. Now, sometimes I need predictability and routine, and that's sometimes I like a bit of variety in my life, but on other things, routine is very important. For example, I get really depressed when certain things aren't orderly in my life, and it's not like a mild discomfort. It's like really bothers me. And maybe the most telling reflection I can give you about autism is difficulty being misunderstood. Even when I'm trying hard to explain myself in social situations, and even when I'm trying to put my best foot forward and show myself for who I really am, it's hard for me to come across to other people. And a lot of people with autism have this. Again, some people with autism might not, but I think you should remember with the people on the spectrum in your life to give a little grace if they come off the wrong way, because it takes the message in our minds so long to get to you and so much effort to get to you that if it's not perfect, please understand that that's not our intention. So, as autism goes into special education and as disability empowerment goes into educational transformation, I wanted to say that special education shouldn't be about fixing students. It should be about access, strengths, and individualized support. So your role as a future teacher, and I want to emphasize that it's not just for special ed teachers, it might be even more so important for general ed teachers, because you're going to be the main teacher of record for the big majority of students who aren't in self-contained classes but are actually have an IEP. The majority of students with an IEP are just going to be receiving push-in and pull-out services. So it's important for general ed teachers just as much or even more as special education teachers. So I want you to know your role if you're planning on being a teacher in the future, or even a parent or something like that, or a caretaker, should be you bridge the gap between policy and lived reality. You are the place where those two worlds combine, where our lived reality meets the cold hard facts of the world we live in. And you need to make it work so that educational policy works for us other than the other way around. You also, as a teacher, you also understand what accommodations feel like, not just what they look like on paper, and you need to use that superpower of that empathy of accommodation to really hone in on creating a more, not just a more just classroom, but a more just society for people with disabilities. So as we go in more in depth about the experience of people with autism, let me also tell you why language matters. So let's mention first the idea of identity first versus person first. Some people prefer to be called an autistic person. Some people prefer to be called a person with autism. Now, me personally, as an autistic special education professional, I don't mind, but some people might mind whether you call them one or the other. The most respectful option you can give to us is to ask and listen. That is very important. But one language you should always try to avoid is deficit language. Instead of saying they're low functioning, say they need support. And instead of saying non-compliant, maybe consider that they have a different communication style. Because in the end, all behavior is communication. You need to know that as an educator. And when people can't communicate effectively, they start communicating with behaviors. That's not to say that people don't have their own personalities and some might be like more naturally troublemakers, but you should never assume that. You should always assume that that behavior is a need to communicate something. Even with those people who are quote unquote troublemakers, think about what they're trying to get out of that and plan accordingly as an educator. So, some closing thoughts. Autism is not a tragedy, but misunderstanding is. So, I invite your curiosity. Learn from autistic voices. Question stereotypes and see ability beyond appearances. So, in future episodes, we might be talking about subjects like autism in schools, or burnout, or masking. I talked a little bit about masking in this show and how exhausting it might be. We might talk about accommodations that actually help, or being autistic in adulthood. Remember that autism doesn't need awareness alone, it needs understanding. So let me know what you think about those subjects and see if there is any subject that you like. Again, this is Michael Manticon with The Other Side of the Desk, and it has been a great pleasure to talk with you today. May you go forth and always uphold the individuality and the humanity of people with all abilities. Thank you.